your girls, grab your beers.
Hey everybody, this is Charlie from Anthrax, and you are listening to today's Boondoggle.
This is Mark Metcalf, and you are listening to today's Boondoggle with Bailey on Domain Cleveland Radio.
You are listening to today's Boondoggle with Bailey on Domain Cleveland Radio. Yes, Kato Kalin listens to this all the time.
Welcome to today's Boondoggle. Now here's your host.
I am Monty Heath, so one Heath, and you are listening to today's Boondoggle.
Hey, what's up? It's John from Skillet, and you are listening to today's Boondoggle on Domain Cleveland Radio.
Fasten your seatbelts.
What's going on, everybody? It's Bill Bailey with today's Boondoggle. And a real quick housekeeping note. If you are watching us on YouTube or Rumble or BitChute or the Odyssey channel, please hit that follow and subscribe button. If you're listening to us on Spotify, iTunes, Google, any of the podcast platforms, please hit that follow and subscribe button. Help us build up our numbers so we can bring you conversations like the one that I am so privileged and honored to be having tonight with my friend, my brother, Mr. Matt Pinfield. How you doing, Matt?
Well? Good to see you today, buddy. How's everything?
Yeah, good, man. Good. Wow. I mean, there's just so much to talk about with you. And but you know what I like to do normally when I have somebody on for the first time is go back, way back. So originally, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, you know, I mean, the first thing that I took a major interest in was music from like a very young age. I mean, you know, the first memories I have really are sitting in front of a 45 record player, you know, to play, you know, 7-inch singles that my parents had bought for me and my brother and sister. And I was the youngest of three. And my brother was 10 years older. My sister was 6 years older. So, and, you know, my dad had been in the military. He'd been a military officer, fought in the Korean War as a Marine. And then because of his heart condition, he got an honorable discharge and went back to school because originally I think that he was planning on having a career in the military. And when he got the honorable discharge because of his health, he decided to go back to school. So he went to the University of Georgia, which is where I was born, in Athens, Georgia, you know, the town that, you know, brought us REM and B-52s and so many other people that were, you know, and the Georgia Bulldogs, of course. But, you know, that's where I would live, you know, I don't really have that many memories of it because at a very young age, at the age of, you know, almost 2.5, 3, we moved to New Jersey, to a little town called Denellen, New Jersey. And the only way you might know that is there was a movie called Whiplash that came out, you know, about the
like roller derby or something, right? Or
no, this one was different. This was Miles Teller, the actor. He was a jazz drummer, and
okay, yeah.
And it was the guy that's in like the Farmers Insurance commercials.
Yeah,
he was and he won an Oscar for that role. But there's a scene in the movie where the kid's driving down the street, Miles Teller, and he's racing to Denellen to compete. And he flips his car on the road on Denellen Avenue, which is where I lived when I was a kid. We lived in a 2-family house. You know, my parents didn't have much money, of course. You know, my mom was when before I was born, she was working in Georgia there. But when she had a baby, of course, you know, there was no such, you know, there were no nannies, you know, or any of that other thing, and they really couldn't afford babysitters. So at that young age, my mother stayed at home with me, and my brother and sister were in school. But you know, we were so poor that, you know, we bought a used 45 player that one of the neighbors was selling with a box of 45s. And around that period of time, the things that were big were British Invasion and Motown, and soul records and pop records. So, you know, my first memories are the Beatles, and Beatles are, of course, the main thing. Beatles and Stones, and that was, you know, you got to remember it's mid 1960s. So, we lived in that town, Dunellen, and I immediately fell in love with music. It was the thing I was the most fascinated by, and I loved records that were modern pop records. I did not like those kiddie records, and my parents had bought me some of those, the Disneyland records or
Yeah.
those things that they have for kids. And when we moved to the town that I ended up growing up in East Brunswick, New Jersey, when they had to pull out the refrigerator, they found that I had thrown every one of the children's records under the fridge. I got rid of them because all I wanted to do was listen to like the rock and pop records and soul records that my sister had. I was not having the children's records. So from a very young age, so to know what I wanted to do, I mean, I had a fascination with radio from the time I was a young kid. And those were the days of transistor radios. So if you weren't listening to radio in the car, and it was, in that period of time, very few people even had 8-track players. I don't think 8 tracks had even really reared their head yet. They might have just started. And there were some, cassettes, I'm sure, but really people listened to radio. And, years later, I saw that they used to have record players in cars, but, I never met anybody with record players in cars, And plus you hear the stories about putting a record in a car. You got to change it every song while you're driving. That wouldn't really work out too well. Plus hitting bumps. I mean, would be, it's just really funny when I look at photos of that era. But I loved radio because I loved music. Music was my first love, but then I realized there were people talking about radio and I was absolutely obsessed from a very young age. So, literally in my, preteen years, like 6, 7, 8, I dreamed of, either being a musician or somebody in a band because I love songs and music so much, or being on the radio. And so as time went on, as I got older, in my first band when I was in junior high, the band was called Thunderhead. And we used to play all the, junior high dances, and there was a teen center with a pool table where kids would hang out in East Brunswick, New Jersey, and we were the band from our town. So this is mid 70s, so like 1976. So the music that we were playing was, Bad Company and David Bowie and Bachman Turner Overdrive and Kiss, and doing our best attempts to play Aerosmith and things that were, popular at that time. And some Aerosmith hadn't even really broken through majorly for like another year. I remember when we had, till I was in high school. I mean, it was until they re-released Walk This Way a second time and Dream On. I mean, they'd already had the albums by that time. Rocks and Draw the Line were almost out. I think we're already out before those songs actually became hits the first time around. So that was the music I loved. I was always looking for new music to listen to. That's my parents had a friend, another teacher. We went over their house, and I remember the older brother showing me bands like Aerosmith and Slade, and there was a guy also in junior high in 7th grade that moved to my town and my junior high school from Liverpool, England, and he had things like Bowie and Slade and Gary Glitter and T-Rex and stuff like that. And T-Rex I knew, of course, from Bang a Gong, but I did not know how much hold 70s glam had in the UK. I really wasn't aware of Sweet and bands like that. So I loved all that stuff. But I remember he had the first Kiss album, and I just remember how weird they looked on the cover, how scary those guys looked. I was like, what Gene Simmons with that tongue and his craziness on the cover? I said, check this out. So there was always that interest, but I also like pop and soul. I mean, at that period of time, pop music was everything. You know what I mean? It was so many different things, from Jim Croce to Steely Dan to Deep Purple to Alice Cooper. It was just so diverse. I mean, pop radio was very different than it is now, where it's really, pop is pretty much, really limited to certain sounds, like a poppier hip hop thing now, or it was very different. I mean, everything was in pop because, it was top 40 radio and more inclusive of all different styles and genres of popular music. So
Gotcha.
That was the thing for me. And then, like I said, starting a band, my friends, these kids had a band. Somebody else was supposed to be their singer. I went in one day and sang Rebel, Rebel. I was in, that song had come out in the spring of '74 with that David Bowie album, Diamond Dogs. And I loved it, of course. And that's when I really had discovered Bowie, and I went back and found Ziggy Stardust and all that stuff. But I went to the guy's house. These guys were rehearsing in the basement, and the singer was not great. That's the only way to say it. That's a kind way of saying it. So I got up and said, I can sing that song. So I got up and I sang Rebel, Rebel. And they were like, you're the singer now. And so I started singing for the band, and we did Rebel, Rebel, Suffragette City, all those songs. And like I said, all those other bands that I mentioned to you. So, I was the frontman and singer of a band, and I really, of course, loved doing that. But radio was also an obsession. And at that period of time, we were in central New Jersey. So the stations that you heard were mostly New York radio stations. And at that point, I was also listening to FM because I had an older brother and sister. So I was listening to, album-oriented rock. And they also had great taste. My brother and sister were into a lot of cool music. So, and then I started going to concerts as a young kid. The bands that I saw first were like, Queen doing Night at the Opera in a theater at the Beacon Theater.
Wow.
Jethro Tull at the Garden, Bad Company at the Garden, Aerosmith at the Garden. And so I saw some really great shows when I was very young with my older brother while I was in junior high school. And then, I would go to other shows. Like, there's a place called the New York Palladium where for the first time I saw Cheap Trick, UFO, and Rush all on the same bill.
Wow.
Or Judas Priest with this band I loved from New Jersey called Stars that were managed by Kisses with a Z. And REO Speedwagon, who we had no idea who REO Speedwagon was because they didn't play them on the radio in New York. But they were headlining because there were enough people, I guess, from the Midwest where they were popular. This is way before they broke through with, High Infidelity to when they had a live album out. So, we'd see all these bands and go see these bills. And but one of the things I did when I was 10 years old was I became friendly with a DJ, a guy, his name was Rich Phoenix. There was a local radio station in a town, New Brunswick, where Rutgers University is, where I ended up doing college radio and DJing in rock clubs in that area, when I became, a teenager and the drinking age was 18. But I would call this DJ up and I befriended him, and, I would call him, and he was the only one on there that played cool music. Like, in other words, he played things that were on the chart, but he was a Beatles fanatic. And, he played everything, from the Beatles to Raspberries to, things you would expect, some Led Zeppelin. And I ended up eventually convincing him to let me come up and visit him in this. And it was, it was a very dangerous town in that period of the 70s when I was like 10 years old. I'm backing up a little bit from before I had the band, but my parents dropped me off there, and I went into the studio and watched him do his show one night. And, I was in love with it. I was like, man, I wish I could do this. So, at some point, because of my obsession with radio and the fact that I wanted to do it, my father, at this point, fast forward, he had become a physics teacher, and eventually head of the science department at the school because he was, really a smart guy. But he also ran the audiovisual department at the high school. So he had a catalog where Bill, it was crazy. He had a catalog where you could buy like a kit to build an AM transmitter. And he built this AM transmitter in the basement. And it only broadcast like 2 blocks. But we put together some cheap beat-up turntables and a Radio Shack mixer and a microphone. And me and my friends would do radio shows.
That's awesome.
We were like, 10, I think 9, 10, 11, like those years, right before junior high, right before puberty, And we were doing radio shows there.
We got so many parallels, Matt. It's amazing. It's like my dad was a World War II Marine. I didn't have access to like a studio, but I was infatuated at a young age too with, like Johnny Carson, watching him and somebody, hosting shows and listening. We had WMMS here in Cleveland, so I would get a tape recorder and I would just record myself, and I'd do skits and all kinds of stuff at a young age, And then Kiss was my gateway too. My older sister would get vinyl records for Christmas. I've shared this story before, and she was big like Leif Garrett and Rod Stewart fan. And one year she opens up Kiss Alive, and she's like, "Ew, what is this?" And I'm across the room, and I'm like, "Oh," and it ended up being mine, and that was it, man. I was hooked.
That was a big record, Kiss Alive, because that's what got a lot of the other people that I knew in junior high into Kiss at that period of time, and it was it was their breakthrough record, that Double Live record, and and they had the 3 albums before it, Kiss, Hotter Than Hell, and Dressed to Kill, and I loved them all. And I would mow lawns and deliver papers to buy records. But it's funny you talk about how you used to record on a cassette, because that's what I used to do. I used to do fake radio shows. Like I record the song and then talk. And I remember driving from New Jersey to Florida to visit my sister after she got married, and I'm in the back of the car with these like old beat up cans headphones, and people looking at me. My mother still remembers it. My mother's 90. And she remembers like people looking at me like I was an alien in the backseat of the car, but I had just headphones on so I wouldn't torture my parents. And then I'd make these cassettes that were like my radio shows, or,
awesome.
The only person listening to them was me, but it was the dream that you had. And it's like, that's what you do as a young person. And now, of course, technology makes it so young people can, see what they do, hear what they do. There's such an advantage. But when you wanted to do that in those days, in the 70s or 80s, you really had to work very hard at it. It was just the same thing with being able to get on the radio. I'll tell you this story too. In high school, they had a class for radio, and they kept lying to us, telling us, "Oh yeah, we're going to eventually get a license, get a radio station here at the high school." And I wanted to believe them, but at 16 years old, we had the course to learn what you needed. See, back then, they deregulated everything, but back then you had to have a third class radio telephone. It was called, it was a third class radio telephone license. What that meant was you were able to take readings on and control a transmitter. That was really the only way you could even get into college radio at that period of time. Of course, now anybody can just do a radio show and they have a producer, and it's much easier and things are all automated. But even when I was in college radio at Rutgers, I mean, you had to take readings on the transmitter and make sure that it stayed within a legal bound, every single hour. So at 16, I studied for this test, and there were 3 elements of the test: 1, 2, and 9. And 9 was the hard stuff. And you could only take the test once in 6 months. If you failed, you had to wait 6 months to back and take it. So I passed element 1 and 2, but 9 was so difficult, I failed it, and I was brokenhearted. I didn't have a radio station to be on anyway. At that point, I was about 15, but at 16, I went back and took the test again and passed it. And, took a bus into New York City to the FCC and took the test. And then I did my first college radio show, it was a pledge drive. Like, in other words, you had to put money up because they were trying to raise money for the college radio station. And I went on the radio for 2 hours or an hour or 2 hours at the Rutgers station. I remember them saying to me, "Man, you're really good. You could really do this." And of course, I wasn't old enough, but I tried to get away with getting on the air that summer, and they busted me. So I wasn't able to do a show there for like another year or so till I graduated, and then was actually at college age. But it had planted the seed, and then I did college radio there at Rutgers, and then I started becoming a nightclub DJ in the rock and alternative clubs, and believe it or not, supported myself for years doing that before I actually ever got a chance to be on the radio, like more than for a part-timer. And and you mentioned WMMS, Bill. I love that station, and I got to work with Kid Leo at Columbia Records, who's a legend of Cleveland and MMS.
Oh yeah,
just one of the great, radio people that broke bands like Ronnie Bingham in Los Angeles. And I mean, but Kid Leo's a legend, and I worked with him when I did A&R at Columbia Records. Leo was working there as well. And of course, now he also, I mean, if he's still there, he was helping program, Little Steven's Underground Garage on Sirius XM and working with that in Outlaw Country for a while. So, I became friends with Leo, and he had that reputation for breaking so many bands. I mean, so many records.
Oh, yeah.
We weren't quite as lucky in New York, and don't get me wrong. I respect a lot of the DJs there. I don't blame them. I blame the people that were in charge of the music and programming. And there was some good stuff, but I always thought when I would go, I didn't travel much because we didn't have much money. But when I did, and I heard rock radio in other markets, even Philly, like when I was in South Jersey at like my godfather's framing houses one summer, or getting in a pit of cement as a masonry, I discovered more bands on Philly radio stations than New York radio stations. So it was markets like Cleveland that were the leaders where you're from.
Yeah, yeah.
So, as much as I love all the DJs and have gotten to know the DJs that I listened to as a kid growing up and have worked with them at either Sirius XM or other stations, I always felt New York radio fell short, and it actually drove me even harder to want to get into radio because I felt like they were missing out the boat on so many great rock artists in the 70s. And by the 80s, of course, I was doing college radio, so I was doing whatever I wanted in college radio, and music had changed quite a bit too. I was still playing a ton of rock, but I also played punk and new wave stuff. So it was a good fertile time to get into college radio. So that's why, I'm very, very blessed that I, was able to make a career out of doing radio, something that I wanted to do and loved and pretended I was doing from the time I was a child.
And that's awesome because it's like, you had that drive, that passion, and that support, from your family. I remember when I was doing that as a kid and my hopes and dreams, but unfortunately people that I kind of like, as we'll get into about like our fears and insecurities as kids and stuff that are sometimes planted in us by people that love us and mean well. I had somebody telling me the opposite. Oh, that's not for you. That's not, and then it just, you're a kid and you just listen to what they're telling you and you don't go for it. And now, like all these years later, now I'm like doing this podcast because I'm like, damn it, I'm going to still try and chase after these dreams I had as a child,
Of course. And that's a great thing. That is the beauty of new technology, is that you can and do have an opportunity to have a platform to do things which didn't exist back then. I mean, if you didn't get on college radio back then, or you weren't in a smaller like market, where I know a lot of people that started as working at radio stations when they were 16, but I would have dreamed of that when I was a kid. But, there were only so many stations and we were surrounded by Philly and New York, and, getting into those stations as somebody new, like when everybody else on the planet was trying to, that was the pinnacle to, if you could get a gig on a New York radio station. I mean, that's why I started in college radio, and then I did the Jersey Shore for many years. But, but I know what you're talking about. It's really important. I don't think necessarily, that was a good thing about my father, and that, maybe we didn't have much money, because we didn't. Definitely not on a teacher's salary. Everybody's really well aware of that. But he used the other creative things he did to try and help. And at the time, when you're young, you don't realize that. You're like, wow, this is great.
Yeah.
But when you get older, my dad's no longer alive. He passed in 2008. I realized how many things he did that had an effect on me. And, it's so true. We're so impressionable when we're younger, and we're already dealing with peer pressure and, whether we're trying to be accepted by those, people. Yeah. And there's bullies, and there's assholes, and there's just people. And you don't realize until you get older how fucked up they were and how fucked up their parents were and treated them. And that's why they got the way they were. But it was one of those things where there were little things that my dad would do, like helping me build that station, which of course I only did really until about puberty, because, you're older and you're really interested in girls, but I never lost the want to eventually get into radio or be a rock star. It was one or the other, right? And so,
you went on, with your musical or working with the radio stations, following that dream. And then, like, when did like the advent of like catching the eye of MTV when MTV came out. And
You know, I got to tell you, and one of the things that's really interesting to me when I try to think back about it and the influence of my father, right, is that so I was like every other kid, like kids are now. Kids are, obviously, with technology, they're making movies, films, and whatever they're doing with TikTok and all these other and YouTube. They've been doing for a long time. But I was one of those kids early on that I think people probably thought was a weirdo, but I was super interested, and I was a weirdo because music was my obsession. But my dad had one of the very first ever, and it wasn't his, it belonged to the school system, but he had one of the big Sony cameras, and it was connected by wire to this big open video recorder. So they were called VTRs, not VCRs, videotape recorders. And they were big open reels, like the reel-to-reels that you would have seen in the 60s and 70s. And it was new technology, and the schools had them. And what my dad would do, secretly, was bring that home during the summer or during Christmas break or, spring break.
Yeah.
And me and my friends would make movies in the basement, I mean, we didn't have endless tape to use, so we'd have to record over things, but he'd get us like one tape, and we'd make movies in the basement. And very early,
got you comfortable being in front of a camera then already.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's what I think. I think to myself, I'm like, well, the seeds were planted, and I never really thought about it until years later. But that certainly was a part of it. MTV came along while I was in college radio. So MTV started in 1981. Not everybody had it. I didn't have it in my house. My friends had it. We heard about this new thing. Sometimes you'd go watch it at other people's houses, but I would have a friend at that period of time. VHS tapes were some people had beta, which of course faded into obscurity very quickly, and most people had VHS tapes. So I had friends that would tape, hours. They'd go on the 6-hour mode on a tape, on low quality, and record MTV for me, or they'd sit there and record videos that they thought were cool. And that was my introduction to MTV back in the very beginning of the 1980s. And it made sense because the things that were kind of breaking through on MTV were also, kind of breaking through in college radio. So there was the timing synergy that was happening there. And I was very interested in it. And I certainly loved it. I just never really honestly thought, not that I wouldn't have loved to have done it, but I never really saw myself doing that, to be honest with you. I always thought radio was going to be the thing. I didn't really think I had a chance of being on television at that, to be honest with you. And the story is very interesting, Bill, because, when I finally did get the opportunity to be on MTV, it was years later. I had worked 3-4 nights a week DJing in nightclubs and built up a pretty big following doing that. So that's how I supported myself. And I had a daughter very young, in my early 20s, I had to do that. Me and her mother both worked. And, then the radio station signed on alternative is part of the word, because it wasn't really a straight up alternative. It was just an album rock station freeform, but it was commercial. So in other words, it did have advertising, sell advertising. It was, so you got paid, but you got paid like less than, it was minimum wage no matter what, and these guys signed on this cool radio station, WHTG, in the Asbury Park, New Jersey area. And I found out about this from a friend. A guy walked into a record store that my friend owned, and where I would buy all my like imports and stuff that I would spin at the clubs. And he said, "Hey man, Matt, there's," he knew about, my college radio show. I was like a big fish in a small pond. I built a big following through college radio. And one of the reasons why was because I would also support local bands. I was encouraging local artists to send me their demo tapes and bring in cassettes or reel-to-reels. And then we would play them and help, them get a crowd for their live shows in the area of, central New Jersey. So this guy comes into a record store and he goes, "Hey man, so there's this radio station that you should be on." I'm like, "Really? Where?" And he says, "The Jersey Shore." I'm like, "Look, what?" But oddly enough, it didn't really come in where I lived. I mean, it was, you had to drive like 45 minutes south or a half hour south just to get it in, because it was literally on the shore, and I was in central Jersey. So I found out about it. I made him a demo tape. I called him up, and this guy, Mike Marone, answered the phone and said, "Hey, I know you from the college radio. I used to work at this Gem import record distributors, and I've heard you on the air. Make a demo for us and bring it in." And I made a demo, and they liked it because I'd had practice, being on college radio. And then I started doing weekends, and I was on weekends, Saturday and Sunday nights. And then whatever shift they would give me, like, in other words, if somebody didn't want to work on the holidays, I drive through the snowstorm. If somebody couldn't do an overnight, I would do it. I would just do whatever it took. That's how badly I wanted to be in radio. And so, you had to pay your dues. I went through one New Year's Eve into New Year's Day where I DJ'd all night. There was a massive snowstorm. And I ran out of gas on a big empty highway in the snow and had to walk with a gas can several miles and find a gas station that was open on New Year's Day. You know what I mean? This is like the mid 80s. And then, eventually get it, but that was just, that's what you do, and you get through it. So eventually I got an opportunity to be the music director at that radio station. And once I became the music director, I had contact with the record industry, people that were, promo people that were working records that needed airplay or were trying to get airplay. And that changed everything, because then people understood that there was a passionate guy out there who loved music. And I'm not saying I was the only one, but I was definitely one of the people that wasn't being like the nasty gatekeeper. I think the best way to describe it was I was looking for reasons to play people's records, not to play them. Yeah. So, so that changed everything. And then an opportunity came along where the people at MTV in the music department were tracking. They liked the station, and it didn't have a big signal, but it broadcast into Lower Manhattan, and it broadcast across the water into Lower Long Island, because we were by the shore. Where you couldn't get it in Central Jersey. It was one of those things that depended on how low the land was, whether you could hear our station or not. So some of those people became regular listeners, loved the station, and they started calling me up and saying, "Hey man, do you mind if we track records with you? Because as we pick videos, want to know if they actually have some heat on them. If people really like these songs, we'd just love to, pick your brain on a regular basis." And that started a friendship with me and the people in the music department at MTV. And at one point I saw that Dave Kendall was leaving 120 Minutes. And that was the alternative show that was on Sunday nights. And I called them up. I read in what they had. Back then they had these things called radio trades. Now they have them online, like Ramp and All Access and Inside Radio, and they have the charts of airplay, and that's what they have. But back then they were like, they were all print, because we're talking about, early 90s. And so I call up this guy Kurt Stefik from the MTV Music Department, and I said, "Hey, dude, what's going on? Like, what happened to Dave Kendall?" He goes, "Oh, I don't know. They blew him out. Something happened. I think he was smoking in the office and part of the building caught on fire. Something crazy. I don't know." There's been all kinds of rumors, but I mean, I like Dave Kendall very much. I give him a lot of credit for helping start 120 Minutes and being being on the forefront of that. And so I said, just naively to them, I said, and I was being naive, and I wasn't being cocky. I just said it because I really believe this. And I said, "Look, you guys need somebody like me to host that show, or who artists respect and knows something about the music." And I wasn't saying that they didn't. I was just saying they needed somebody. It couldn't just be a talking head. Yeah. And the response was really funny. Kurt Stefik said, "Well, I don't know if they'll think you're in the demo, but I'll call you back in like a week." And the joke is I went on to work for MTV, even behind the scenes on and off, till like the mid 2010s, like 2013 or 14, on and off, doing different things for them. So can you imagine when I heard that in 1992? I don't know if you'll be in the demo. So that's right. But I mean, then again, who would have thought they would have put a bald guy on TV, especially a chubby bald guy from New Jersey who talks with his hands like an Italian Irishman, like I am, and English, by the way, but mostly Irish, some Italian, some English as well.
But you got our attention. You know, you had everybody's attention. Like I remember, you know, when we first got MTV here, and you know, the two biggest shows for me that exposed me to some of the music that I still listen to today that I wasn't hearing on the radio as much was, you know, Headbangers Ball with Ricky Ratman, and then 120 Minutes with Matt Pinfield. And you guys like got me into so much music that I wouldn't have heard anywhere else that I'm still a fan of today. And I have my own collections. And man, I had the pleasure of having Ricky on this show already. And now I got you, man. I'm going through my MTV bucket list, man.
Well, that's fantastic. I love Ricky, you know. Ricky's a great guy, man. He's out on tour right now on the road, you know, doing this thing where he's telling the story about, you know, the days at the Cat House and being Axl's roommate and Headbangers Ball. So, yeah, you know, it's and that's a great thing, you know. I mean, I got nothing but love and respect for Ricky. So at this point, when, you know, I loved 120 Minutes too, and this is a really crazy thing to admit, but I went through a period where I moved with my daughter, so there was an actual year and a half where I didn't have MTV at all, which was bizarre, you know, because I had MTV when she was super little, and then I moved to this new apartment and was running a radio station, but did not have MTV there, which was nuts. And it was even around that time, believe it or not. So when I said that to Kurt Stefik, he said, you know, I'll check with them. I'll get back to you in a week. And then he called me an hour later after I said to him, like, hey, man, you guys should have somebody like me on there. And he goes, hey, they want you to come in for an audition. And I was like, really? I was totally in shock, but I was super excited about it. And then they went in, I did an audition. I laughed because I had like a Morrissey shirt with a rip on it, you know. I didn't like, I just, you know, I wasn't, you know, I was certainly, you know, I was a face for radio and a guy who was dressed just like, you know, whatever. I mean, it was just so funny. And the joke is that I also ended up on The Real World season 1 for like a brief minute, because that club that I DJ'd in, the Melody, there was this band called Rain Dance. And that guy, Andre, who was in Rain Dance, was one of the people who lived in the first Real World house. And his guitarist is Dean, who's in Queens of the Stone Age and The Dead Weather. And, you know, it's crazy. But, you know, because, you know, he's from Detroit, you know, where Jack White's from. But it's just like this crazy thing I ended up on there. And that's another situation where I went to work with the stained shirt. I was hungover from the night before. And then that thing aired, you know, it was new then. They're like, hey, we're going to be on the show called The Real World. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. You know, and I forgot they were coming. And they came and they shot with me. And then like 1,000 times you saw my dirty shirt on TV. But that was before, you know, they called me up. They did the audition. And one day they call me and they say, look, it's 120 minutes. Right now, we don't have a host. So Depeche Mode are coming on, but they do not want to host. They want to be interviewed. So that's the first show that I did where I hosted it in 93. It was the winter of 93. It was around Songs of Faith and Devotion. I went on there, did the interview with them. I was a little stiff, but I wasn't bad for a guy who'd never ever done TV before. And you know, they called me back up and invited me up to the offices. And I'm like, wow, maybe they're going to hire me. This will be amazing. And when I get there, they said to me, Matt, we're going to use you as a backup, but we're going to have Louis Largent, who, you know, our vice president of music, and to do the show. And when he can't do it, we'll have you in. And it was a bit heartbreaking. And speaking of heartbreaking, Louis died recently, and he was a very dear friend of mine. And that was a horrible thing for me, the news to get, because I loved Louis very much, and I ended up in the music department with him. So that's where the story goes next, Bill. You know, a year goes by, and people ask me, well, all right, so you didn't get the show the first time. They asked me two things. How did you deal with the fact that everybody, they did newspaper articles, and everybody in your town, in your area of New Jersey, knew you were on the show once, but you didn't get the show? How did you deal with that kind of like disappointment, heartbreak, and having to answer people on a regular basis. And I said, well, I put the most positive spin on it I could, because when they did say to me, we're going to use you as a backup, whether or not that was true or not, and I didn't completely believe that, that's what I told people. I said, well, they're going to use me as a backup. And every, I won these two national radio awards, National Alternative Music Director of the Year, where you're voted on by your peers and record labels for 91 and 92 before that. And I was that was also very much a surprise to me, because I was really blown away by that. It was usually only people from major cities. So when Asbury Park won, people were like, who is this guy? And I was just a music enthusiast, and I wanted to break as many artists as I could at the radio station. And I did not expect to ever be on TV again. And this is the really interesting thing. Andy Schoen, who hired me at MTV, who is, I have so much to thank for giving me a shot there. I called him like once a month. There was no internet yet. There was none of this stuff. And the only way that I could stay in touch with him was to be on his call log. And I didn't really expect him to call me back, but I just didn't want him to think. I wanted to stay on his radar. So I didn't harass him. And this is what I tell people to do when they ask me, what do you do? I go, well, let people know you're there, but don't harass them and don't drive them nuts. And that was like, there's got to be a balance. So every month I'm
still learning that.
Well, we all do, we all learn. We all got life lessons all the time. And so, I just kept doing my radio thing, and, I'd hit a wall there because I loved the radio station. We were Rolling Stone's medium market station of the year, and voted by fans and listeners. We'd broken a lot of artists. But I was still working 3 or 4 jobs because, even being an award-winning music director and doing afternoons on the station, I was making less than, somebody who was working at a fast food restaurant at that period of time. But I loved what I did. So, that was the thing. And I just worked as many jobs as I could so I could keep living, like pursuing the dream. That was what it was. And so one day, I find out I get a call that they're looking for new people in the music department. And because 3 people were leaving, and the music department are the 10 people that picked all the videos and worked on the unplugs and the storytellers and the whatever, like all those different things, and programmed the music for Headbangers Ball, 120 minutes, Yo MTV Raps, and literally everything, VMAs, you name it. And I'd always stayed in touch, and eventually I got that call, and to come in and interview for it. And it was unbelievable when I went there because, again, when they saw me talk with my hands, I'm like, am I freaking them out? Because I'm so expressive, which is very much an Northeast, East Coast thing, whatever. Or maybe, I don't know what it is. But, eventually I'm waiting to hear about this job. And I work on a radio station that only has 3 phone lines. The radio station, there's a documentary on it if people want to look it up. The station was WHTG. Modern rock at the Jersey Shore, and it was in a house. A woman owned the station, who lived on the other side of the house. And although it was so influential, and you hear about Bruce Springsteen listened to it, everybody. It was just one of those things where it was a really important radio station. Nobody made a dime, and it was owned by a woman who lived in the house, a very eccentric woman named Faye Gate, who was ultimately was a lovely woman, and she was the one who told the new program director who came in at one point, before you hire a new music director or pick one, you need to meet this guy. And so I have her also to thank for that. And she's no longer with us. But I got to be honest with you, I was waiting for this phone call to find out what was happening, whether I got this job in the MTV Music Department, and because I needed to make a move in my life at that period of time. And every time, for 3 or 4 hours, you got to remember, there's a sales office, there's a production office, there's a front desk reception, and the request line. They were all the same lines. So there were only 3. And I think at that point, we might have had 1 push button phone. Some of them were still dial up. You know what I mean? I mean, it was all old equipment. Our equipment was shit. But it was a labor of love, and it was a great radio station. And I'm sitting there like I'm losing it because I can't obviously go, hey, they're calling me about another job. You're not going to say that while you're there. I'm like, fuck, what if, and I had this like really crazy feeling like, what if I holy shit, what if he changes their mind because they can't get through? You know, that kind of thing. I mean, I had all those crazy thoughts going through my head. And then eventually the phone rings and it is Andy Schoen. And he says to me, hey, Matt, I've been trying to call the radio station for 3 hours. So, I'm sorry, Andy. There's only 3 lines here, man, for the entire station. And the request line's always going in the front office and the sales department. He goes, I'll tell you what, come work for me and I'll make sure you have more than 3 lines in your office. And that was the day my life changed. I mean, completely. And I went to work at MTV, and I want to, finish by saying when I went to work there at MTV in the music department, it was an incredible job to have, being one of the 10 people that picked the music and worked on all the specials. Helped convince the channel to do Kiss Unplugged, which they were not really convinced until I went in there with Alex Coletti, who produced the Unplugged. So, there were a lot of different incredible things to be a part of. But I want to make it really clear that I never expected to be on TV again, ever. Like, I was afraid to even bring it up that I was on there at all, because the last thing I wanted them to do is, oh, he didn't want this job. He's just trying to get on TV. I was really worried that they thought I'd have a hidden agenda. So I'd never brought up being on TV. So I never thought I'd be on TV again, other than that one time I was in 93. And I never thought I'd be able to do radio again, because I thought I was going. I mean, I had to leave the radio station. And that day I went home and I sat at the kitchen table. And I had felt like something had died at the same time. There was an excitement. There was a bittersweetness to the fact that I was going to work at MTV, but the radio station was done. So I'm not doing a radio show anymore. So there was there was that give and take. And little did I know that, a few months after I'd worked there, they would say, hey, you were pretty good that time. We're going to give you 3 more weeks. And then after 1 week, they were like, hey, you got the gig, which was 120 minutes, which was incredible. And then I did Matt Rock, which was the later Headbangers Ball, and that was really Headbangers Ball with different graphics and a different name, but it was Headbangers Ball. So, but it was an incredible time, an incredible ride. And I was there through, that whole period of the 90s. And, and I moved to LA for Farm Club that I did, worked with Andy Schoen again. He was like one of the heads there with Jimmy Iovine.
And I wanted to talk to you about Farm Club real quick, because I remember you're watching the very first episode on USA. And there's another Cleveland connection we have there, because my friends in the band Chimera were on that first inaugural Farm Club episode of yours.
Yeah, we're a really great band. I always loved those guys. And that was listen, that show was so ahead of its time. The idea was, before anybody had broadband or really had the technology, was for artists to upload their music, people to vote on it, and you had a TV show, a record label, and a website. It was a brilliant idea from Jimmy Iovine and Doug Morris, who, Doug Morris is now, I think, one of the heads of Universal. He's done so many different things. And obviously Jimmy Iovine, is pretty much retired after, having done beats and, selling beats to Apple Music and all the other stuff. But, they wanted me to be the first ever pitch man for Beats headphones. Years later, I got a call from Jimmy and Luke Wood and Dre when they were on the Home Shopping Network. Nobody knew what Beats headphones were yet. And I was like, oh, can I tell you tomorrow? Because I have to go to South by Southwest. I have to host this broadcast. And they're like, well, call us back in 24 hours. And I called back and said, I can do it. And they're like, Home Shopping Network sucks. They only want to use their own people. They use the excuse that we didn't know right away. I'm like, well, fuck them. Anyway, so that's a really funny story. But yeah, so Farm Club was way ahead of its time. And the woman who produced it, who used to work at MTV before that, Audrey Morrissey, has produced The Voice every single season and a bunch of other things. And we sat in my hotel room when I was there and came up with the idea of going to see people and visit them where they work and in their hometowns. And that was the first show that ever did that. And it became a regular thing on Idol and all these other shows. Any reality show, when they go back and they do a backstory, it's called a package. We came up with that in my hotel room, and no one was doing it before that. I don't care,
Yeah, Jimmy, the bass player at Chimera, is a good friend of mine, and he owns a barbershop. He cuts my hair now.
That's great. I love those guys. Yeah, they're really cool.
They're getting ready to do a little reunion thing at the Cleveland Agora in May, so excited about that.
Cleveland's so legendary,
Speaking of Cleveland music, I've heard you mention this before, and being the walking encyclopedia of music that you are, talk about how the Dead Boys have influenced you.
You know, you're not going to believe this. I just wrote for a new book that's coming out. Mitchell Cohen, who wrote the book on Arista Records, and he co-wrote my book. My book that I wrote, all these things that I've done, my insane, improbable rock life. Mitchell was my co-writer on that because I needed somebody to help organize my thoughts when I wrote my memoir in 2015 that was released in 2016. Mitchell was working on a new book, and it had to be about an artist or an album that was very important and influential, but did not make it into the Billboard Hot 100. And so I picked the Dead Boys, Young, Loud, and Snotty, to write about. And there are a lot of other really well-known journalists and writers in there. Lenny Kaye, of course, who created who's from the Patti Smith group and, came up with the whole Nuggets idea, that first album, Original Artifacts from the first psychedelic era. And I had to pick an album to write about. And so I literally just turned it in the other day for this book that's coming out on these albums. But I picked the Cleveland band, the Dead Boys, Young, Loud, and Snotty, because I think it's one of the most important albums in the history of punk. And it's interesting because Rolling Stone, in their greatest punk albums of all time, put it at number 7. But I don't hear it referred to enough by other journalists and people to really understand how important that Dead Boys record is. And obviously the second one was a little more slick. They had a lot of trouble finishing it. There's, because like everything else, there's, drugs, insanity, and everything else that goes along with it. Of course, on the second album, they did Ain't It Fun, and then Guns N' Roses covered it and made Cheetah Chrome a lot of money because they put it on their greatest hits. But I think the first Dead Boys record, Young, Loud, and Snotty with Sonic Reducer, is one of the greatest punk records ever made. And it's interesting how they moved to New York and became a part of the whole CBGB scene. But I love that record. I think look, I'm not the only one, right? I mean, Pearl Jam covered Sonic Reducer. Their band before that, Green River, did Ain't Nothing to Do from that record. Corey Taylor from Slipknot on his solo tour was doing All This and More, and actually has a cover of that on his CMF B-sides, EP that he put out, where he covered these. Nice. So there are many fans of that Dead Boys record, but it just doesn't get the respect it deserves. So as far as a punk record goes, I just think it's
yeah. Well, I've heard you on quite a few interviews putting it out there, man. So definitely, that's awesome. That you are a big fan of them, and a Cleveland band. And what are some other, being the musical encyclopedia you are, what are some other Cleveland influenced bands that you've been?
One of my favorites is the Raspberries, who were very much a pop band out of Cleveland, with Eric Carmen was the lead vocalist. But I love the Raspberries. And, it's funny. That's the one thing that's really interesting. People like me and Eddie Trunk both agree on the Raspberries being great. And Raspberries were very much this pop band that had, just really like 3 hits. And a semi-4th hit back in the 1970s. In the early 70s, he did the song Go All the Way, which was just an absolutely incredible song. It was one of the loudest singles ever recorded. It was certainly inspired by Beatles and Dave Clark 5 and British Invasion stuff, Beach Boys. Then they had I Want to Be With You Tonight, and a song called Overnight Sensation Hit Record, which Bruce Springsteen's gone on to say is one of his favorite singles of all time. Cleveland is just, there's just been a lot of really cool stuff out of there, right? I mean, because you can also say, right, you can say James Gang, right?
Yeah.
You could also say Nine Inch Nails if you want to take Trent, right, from being from around that area. Yeah. Which other bands did you say think you would like?
Well, I mean, we had, Michael Stanley, of course.
And by the way, I was a big Michael Stanley fan. I got that double live album that he put out called Backstage Pass when I was a teenager. And there was a song there called Nothing's Gonna Change My Mind that I loved. That was like a pop record. And then he went on to have many other hits like He Don't Love You. And, so I used to buy all Michael Stanley's records, when I was a teenager. And never knew he was from Cleveland back then, So who else would you think of?
Well, some of the ones that I had the privilege of becoming personal friends with, like I mentioned, Chimera, Mushroom Head.
Yeah, of course, great, and the great band. right?
But you know, if we look back at the older stuff, like, I mean, I was growing up here, but I never got to see like any of the indie club shows of Nine Inch Nails because I think I was in high school at the time. And then I went off into the Navy when like they really hit it with Downward Spiral. So by the time I was finally getting to see Nine Inch Nails, they were playing big auditoriums and stuff, you know?
Yeah. And they're just one of the great bands. And Trent and I, you know, were friends, you know, have been friends for many years. I saw him last year for the first time in ages, where we just got to hang out and talk to each other about everything from sobriety to life, you know. And that was just like backstage at that Welcome to Rockville Daytona last year. It was just so good to see him and hug him. And, you know, Trent is, you know, he's the kind of person that he, you know, he's got to like you and trust you. And, you know, that was the thing. But we've been friends from the very, very beginning of Pretty Hate Machine. So, always been on good terms, you know.
Well, Mark O'Shea's a good friend of mine. Their old tour manager, Mark O'Shea. He I was just at his house for his birthday party. We become close friends, and you know, he's part of our fellowship as well. So
yeah, and you should talk about that too. We should talk about how sobriety.
Yeah, that's what I definitely I wanted to get into that with you because, like, you know, you've had all these like this amazing career and this amazing life, but how much after you had this like near death experience have you really feel like you're starting to live now, you know?
Well, I mean, I think the real truth is that, you know, these two major life events took place. So obviously the time that I was hit by the car here in Hollywood, which wasn't my fault. It was somebody driving, texting, or on the phone. And, you know, I was nearly killed. I was crossing the street, and at the time I wasn't drunk. You know, I was just walking across the street like 7:30 at night, and from a strip mall. And you know, a woman ran a red light and, you know, hit me, and I jumped up, which saved my life because I saw her in the corner of my eye, snapped my leg in half, went through her windshield, tore my head open, my entire head open, and then I went through her windshield with my body, and then was thrown. She hit the brakes, and I flew out of the car, flew in the air, and landed on the side of the street. And they basically told me in the ambulance that they were amazed that I wasn't paralyzed or dead. And then it was a long road to recovery, 8 months of, you know, walking on a walker, physical therapy, walking on a cane. And, you know, now I've got a metal rod in that right leg, and they did a beautiful job of sewing up my head. It was completely torn open and my ear partially back on. But, you know, I'm very grateful because it could have been so much worse. Had I not seen the car, I would have been under it, probably dead. Had I, even if it was a split second, it was unbelievable. And so that, and then struggling for years with drugs and alcohol, and literally wanting to beat it and trying endlessly before it actually started to take hold. And here I am coming up on 3 years sober now because something changed in me. And I think, you know, that's, you know, I tried to embrace the program and recovery, and I was in and out of meetings and in and out of treatment centers, and, you know, just coming back and forth. And eventually it just really, between the, you know, support and the love of my friends and my brothers and sisters in recovery, it changed everything for me. And, you know, and so I consider myself extremely blessed that I had, you know, that thing, it just clicked, and it's where I'm at right now. And it's something that, you know, you live with forever. And the one way to, you know, to keep things going is to stay in the center of the recovery program and be of service and help others. And that's what I do. And I, you know, that's why, you know, I do the you know, the Sound Sobriety and Success podcast. And I also, you know, I'm constantly working with guys that are, you know, like sponsees, that are, you know, type sponsees, people that I took. And I have, you know, we all have sponsors. You know, I don't use the actual name of the program because it's part of the principles not to mention what it's called, but everybody knows which one it is. And my problem was with alcohol and drugs. I fell in love with alcohol and drugs. I found, you know, I used alcohol because it just made it enhanced at a young age, out of boredom, made you feel different, made you feel more confident, made you enjoy the rock and roll more, or at least you thought so. And, to a degree, yes. I mean, you know, And I'm not saying every experience I had was horrible, because there were obviously some good ones that worked for a while until it didn't.
Yep.
And, you know, in my club years, I got into drugs, I got into cocaine, I got into speed, I got into things that would keep me up longer and keep me going.
Keep me able to drink more. Yep.
Yeah, I can drink more. So that was the thing. I mean, you know, and I grew a love for cocaine and a love for speed and a love for booze, and I just never really wanted the party to end. And by the time it started to really affect my life and cause problems and consequences, I went through many years of trying to get it right and then falling back into it. And it just really happened for me just about 3 years ago. So
what I've kind of, you know, I could speak a little bit on, you know, the interactions that we've had. And you just said yourself, you know, all these years you were trying. Now it's almost like you've kind of, you know, we get to a point of complete surrender, and that's when it really works, when we finally like surrender to our higher power in the program.
Yeah, that's what it is. You know, I got to say that it was real surrender. I think this time around, it was during the pandemic. I was drinking massively. And you know, my friends realized it, you know, and I'd already gone through so many times where, you know, I was affecting my heart. I mean, I was in the hospital one time, and literally they told my friends in the emergency room, they said, "We have no idea how your friend is alive. His heart is going, his readings are off the charts. He should have had a stroke or a heart attack. He shouldn't be alive right now. How's your friend alive?" You know, and usually you would think that would wake you up, you know, but of course, the disease of alcoholism and addiction doesn't really have any logic to it. You know what I mean? It's like it's got to be a power greater than yourself. And whether that is something that you believe in a God or a higher power, or if you believe in the power of numbers of people that are in the program, and that community, whatever that is that works for you, as long as it works. We all choose, you know, like to do things that way. But I've found that this program is the only thing, and that has worked for me. And that's a belief in a higher power and being of service and being part of the community and being active in meetings and you know, surrounding myself with people, that like-minded people that really want to be well and want to, you know, help others, you know, because you know, that whole thing, you know, you can't keep what you don't give away. And
that's why I like being transparent on my show too, and talking about this stuff, because I feel like there's somebody out there that's going to hear something, and that's us reaching out and being of service. And that's why I love your new podcast. I was just listening to, like I said, the episode with Duff, and also, you know, I listened to it on long drives. I just went to Pittsburgh over this past weekend and was hanging out with Frank Bello from Anthrax.
I love Frank.
He was at a con, but during that 2-hour drive, I was listening to your podcast, and while I'm listening to it, it's like I'm still staying centered. I'm still like I'm in a meeting. You know, it's helping get me and my head right before I get ready to go amongst, like, you know, my anxiety would kick in, usually going to crowds and places and stuff.
Oh, but yeah.
You were helping center me on that drive out there.
And you know, that's the reason why, you know, I'm grateful to do that. And I'm glad you're doing this, is I think it's just so important. For me, I understand that part of it is protecting others in situations where it might affect their work or their livelihood. So I think that, you know, there's the anonymous side to recovery. But in a situation like mine, where my friends really got around, and, you know, it wasn't really no secret that I struggled, that while I'm doing well and finding a different way of life in a different direction, I want to share that with others, because I am a public figure. And I think it's really important to let people know that there is another way, and that it can happen for you at any age, because it happened for me in my 50s. I mean, you know, like I said, I tried, but I wasn't really getting there. And I wasn't really, you know, I'd get a few months, you know, 3 months, 6 months, maybe the most 9 months. But, and then it would, you know, I'd fall off, and it wouldn't be honest sobriety. But this time it's completely honest, and I live a life of rigorous honesty, because that's what it requires to be super honest with yourself and with others. I mean, it's a matter of self-preservation, you know, there's only, and you know, but that's what we have the groups for. But I figure that while I have a platform, I'll share my experience, strength, and hope with others, because your life can change greatly. And as long as you're breathing and you're alive and you're upright, even if you're not upright, you can change your life, and you can help to try and change others and help others through it. And it's a really horrible, insidious disease that we've had to deal with. But the important thing is that there is an answer, and there are ways. And I'm not saying there's only one way, but I know the only way that's worked for me is the program. So.
Oh yeah.
So, and I'm 100% into it. And I think that's the other thing too. There's a line: half measures availed us nothing. And that's it. You can't do anything halfway, because we certainly didn't drink halfway.
No, we didn't.
Certainly didn't use halfway. I mean, I'm an all-in kind of guy, just the same way I am with music and everything else that I'm passionate about, and you are.
Yeah.
So we have a tendency to just go all out. And I wasn't a guy who could put down, have 2 drinks and put it down. Maybe I would fool myself into believing that. Like one week I go, hey man, I think I might be all right now, because I only had like 3 Jack Daniels or 2.
Yeah.
Next time 4, and then it's 5, and then you're blacking out, and
Yep.
you don't know who to apologize to or what you did the night before. I mean, everybody's journey is different, but I can tell you,
Sleep so much better now, because I can rest my head, knowing before I go to bed, if there was something that I did wrong, I'm taking an inventory, and how am I going to correct it?
Yeah.
And I'm remembering things now.
It's all about gratitude as well.
Yeah.
Gratitude is such an important part of recovery, because you have to stay in gratitude, because you look at the world right now, and there's just so much negativity and division. There's just there's people fighting over everything, and offended by everything. And I feel that there's enough negativity out there. I want to spread positive energy and talk positively about how my life has changed. And the thing that I say to anyone who's going through a rough time, it's not like every day is a great day for me or for anybody else who's in recovery. We have good days and we have bad days, but the truth is, it's still better than a day where, you don't know what you did and what trouble you get yourself into, or what you won't show up for, those consequences. And, it's not worth it. If you struggle, it's worth fighting to get a grip on your life when it's unmanageable. So, I've got nothing but gratitude. I've had nothing but amazing people in the program and in recovery that have helped me in a big way. And don't worry.
I'm a person that needs that accountability.
And here's the other thing I want to say too, Bill. Don't worry that it's going to take your edge away. Does it look like it's taking away any of mine?
Oh no.
I'm out from, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm just saying, it's
Now we're really living life,
Yeah,
that's our high now.
And it's scary at first when you first get sober, because you're not used to like kind of dealing with people and the public and everything without having that,
that lubricant, that social lubricant,
and you might call comfort level, but it always, it's so unpredictable for us alcoholics that you don't know where it's going to take you, and so it's a better way to live, and I live by the mantra that I don't pick up a drink or do any drugs no matter what, because, and you know what, so far so good, but every day's a new day and a reprieve, and I remember every morning when I wake up that that's the way I've got to live my life, and I go to bed with the same thought in my head. And I'm grateful. Grateful to be alive.
And now you're running and gunning sober, living your life, and all these other opportunities still are opening up for you. Now you're working with the Danny Wimmer team.
Yeah, I'm working with DWP. We have a TV show on AXS TV called The Power Hour. I do with Pabs from Sirius XM Octane, who's amazing. She's great. And also working with Josh Bernstein, who's an incredible guy who put the Golden Gods Awards together, has worked for Revolver, Alternative Press, Loudwire. I mean, he's done so much stuff as well. That's my team over there. And, we work with incredible people from DWP. And, I have a syndicated show that's on around the country called Flashback, which is a classic rock radio show that airs weekends at radio stations across the U.S. And I do KLOS in Los Angeles on Sunday nights, a show called New and Approved. So I keep busy. And then there's another show that I have through Live One, which is a weekly rock countdown. So I'm I keep busy, and when I'm not busy working or hanging out, I have an incredible girlfriend now too that I'm madly in love with, that I live with, and that relationship only would have happened being sober, because she would have ran the other way. I mean, let's be honest, man. I was a wild guy. I was, but I'm just saying, you know what I mean? Any problems that come my way, I can deal with them and make better decisions because I'm sober. So I'm grateful for the work that I have, and I just keep on going, and just, try to be the best version of myself I can be every day. And some days are better than others, man. We're only human, and we're a work in progress, not perfection.
One thing I know, I want to be, conscious of your time and stuff, but one thing I wanted to ask real quick or touch on, because if I don't do this, I'm going to hate myself, but I'm a big fan of the DWP team. I've had the pleasure of getting to work with them through the podcast and the media tents and stuff like that. The last year when we hung out
incarceration.
Incarceration. Danny Hayes introduced me to Master Chief Otis, who is new on the DWP team, and he's a retired Navy Master Chief. And because I'm retired Navy, he connected us. He says, "Hey, why don't you have him on your podcast?" So had Master Chief Otis on here, got to hear about how much the DWP team supports the military and stuff. So I was trying to get Danny Hayes on here. I had this pitch for Danny Hayes, and Danny Hayes wasn't able to make it, but they sent me Holly from marketing in DWP, and she was on here on episode 223. So I was like,
she's great.
Help me out with marketing this idea I have. You guys are going to be in my backyard for Sonic Temple in Columbus this year and Incarceration in Mansfield again this year. And I said, Holly, how can I pitch getting the opportunity to sit on the couch for a couple interviews with my buddy Matt Pinfield and Josh Balls at these festivals? And she's like, you know what? That's something you should ask Matt. So
yeah,
Matt.
Hopefully we're going to be doing that still. I'm not sure if Twitch is going to be the platform we'll be using besides AXS. It might be, but it might be another platform. So you and I will cross that bridge, though. But there's no reason why we can't do something fun together there. Absolutely, with you.
Yeah, for sure. Man.
80, whoever's going to be there. But our crew is a great crew, and I love working with Jose Mangan, Danny Wimmer, Danny Hayes, Maureen Volker, everybody who works on that team are the best. I love them, and I love working with them. It's just
I had to pitch that ball, Matt.
Because, so I'll tell you what,
as a kid, and having people tell me no.
And I'll let you know what's happening.
Yeah.
Because, the Twitch situation is up in the air right now. I know they're in negotiations. So as soon as I know more, I'll tell you when we're off the podcast. But I want to thank you for having me on, Bill. And
thank you for doing this for me. It's such an honor, Matt. I really appreciate it. There's so much more. We'll have to do a part 2 sometime, because there's so much more I wanted to talk to you about.
100%. Believe it or not, tonight I got to head to the Grauman's Chinese Theater. Or is that which one it is, Kara? Yeah, I got to go to the famous Chinese theater in Hollywood here for a recording artist who her name's Vaja. She's got a new video out, and she's got like one of the theaters, and she's doing a Q&A and a big release thing. So
yeah, you're still one of the busiest men in the business.
I'm doing it as a favor, as a friend, because she was like, I'm stuck. It's kind of like the Duff thing, you know? Duff, he was like, Matt, no one's here to interview me. I'm like, dude, I'm on my way. I'm an hour and a half away. I'll be there. So
awesome, Matt. Thank you so much for your time. Real quick, I wanted to, if I get one favor from you before you leave, you mind cutting a promo ID for the show? Just introduce yourself, and you're listening to today's Boondoggle.
Hey, it's Matt Pinfield, and you are listening to my great friend Bill Bailey on today's Boondoggle.
Awesome, Matt. Thank you so much, brother. I appreciate it. And I'd love to follow up with a part 2. There was so much stuff I still wanted to get to, but
we'll do it. Absolutely. I just got to run over there and I apologize to you, Bill. I got to head over and you're not going, where is this guy? And you know how it is trying to get traffic through Hollywood.
Yeah. So
you can only imagine. And I got to get dressed though. I'm just kind of like hanging out. So
that's you. That cramp shirt's perfect.
I really should just wear the cramp shirt. I think it is that thing. So I agree with you.
Morrissey started it all for you. You might as well keep going with the t-shirts now.
Exactly. You know, it's great. Thank you for that. Bill, it was awesome today. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, brother. Love you, Matt.
Love you too, Bill. Take care, buddy.
Bye-bye.